Good afternoon. We are so appreciative of you all joining us today. This is a VLab presentation on the National Hurricane Center Cone of Uncertainty. It was a social behavioral research study. Just delighted to have our partners here. I want to give a thanks and a shout out to Eastern Research Group, Linda Girardi, Lou Nadeau, and Jennifer Sharp, along with some of their folks that worked along with them, with Dr. Jeffrey Lazo and Dr. Betty Morrow. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't highlight our wonderful partnership that we have with our partners down at the Hurricane Center, specifically Robbie Berg and Michael Brennan and others there, but also our Tropical Service Program lead, Jessica Schauer. And it's been a long 2-year research effort that focused on the tropical cyclone forecast track graphic, which we love to call affectionately the cone of uncertainty. And specifically, the research was focusing on how people interpret the cone graphic and or misinterpret. How integral is the cone graphic to our international partners' decision making? How much do important economic sectors rely on the cone graphic for operational decision making? And does the cone graphic meet these users and stakeholder needs? Reminding everyone that it will be a 30-minute presentation. This is the final presentation, and we'll be finishing with the culmination of a final report in the next 2 weeks. 30 minutes for presentation, and then there will be about 30 minutes for questions. We ask that you hold your questions until the end. You are certainly welcome to raise your hand and or use the question pane to the right. So without further ado, I will kick it off to Linda Girardi. We're excited to hear about the presentation, the findings, and recommendations as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen. Okay, so I'm actually here. Jen mentioned the research team, and I will be presenting today with Lou and Jen, who are featured here. They will be explaining a couple of the phases of the research. So just to start off with, this is about the cone graphic, and I put up here an example of the graphic from the National Hurricane Center's website, along with its definition. And this is important because there's a lot of misinterpretations and misconceptions about what this graphic is and is not. So as Jen mentioned, our research project, about 2 years in the making, had 4 key objectives. I'll go through those again just very quickly. One was around how people interpret or misinterpret the cone, how integral it is to decision-making by NHC partners, how key economic sectors rely on the cone for decision-making, and then whether this graphic meets their needs. So we have 3 phases of this research. The very first phase was a pretty comprehensive literature review. Here we looked at about 55 studies, reports, literature, NWS assessments, all kinds of studies that had been conducted having to do with interpretations of this graphic and its implications for decision making. Now, we found that most of these studies really were about the public's use and perceptions of the graphic, though there were a few studies that did focus on respondents, public officials, emergency managers, and broadcasters. We also went ahead and interviewed several meteorologists in international nations and territories, and Jen will tell you a little bit about this. This was important because the cone graphic is not just used in the United States, but it also has international use. So important to find out what these partners, how they use the graphic and whether it's serving their needs. And then finally, we did a comprehensive web-based survey with 4 sectors, key economic sectors that can be very impacted by hurricanes. And these were the energy utility sector, the marine sector, the transportation sector, and the tourism recreation sector. And Lou will tell you more about that survey. So right now I'm going to turn it over to Jen, and she'll tell you a little bit about the literature review.
Okay, great. As Linda pointed out, the first phase of this project was this comprehensive literature review. And we primarily focused on studies from the past few years because the cone has undergone several iterations over time, just to gain those insights into the cone's role in decision making, and then also misinterpretation. So one of the big takeaways from the literature is that the cone is just one piece of a very large puzzle of factors that influence the public's decision making. So, for example, one of the most important short-term decisions that members of the public make is evacuating. And so the literature really does repeatedly emphasize that the cone is the most well-known and pervasive NOAA product that members of the public access, but it also shows that the cone may not have a major impact on those evacuation decisions. So why is that? And what we see time and time again is that the graphic doesn't provide the types of information like storm size and impacts that are most likely to influence decision making. And that's why you see a reliance on this holistic framework of factors that we put on this slide. Now, the ubiquity of the cone combined with this perceived lack or absence of key information highlights a broader challenge for NOAA, and that is that the Hurricane Center and the Weather Service actually do create products that provide these other information needs, but the public doesn't know about them or they might not be able to understand them. Next slide. So besides lacking key information, the literature also shows that people just simply don't understand the cone, and therefore they're likely to misinterpret it. So some common misinterpretations include believing it's an impact visualization. So users have a very false sense of security when they're outside of the cone, and then an exaggerated sense of doom if they're inside it. They also misinterpret the cone as indicating that a hurricane is getting bigger or stronger as it approaches land. And then people can also anchor to the first track they see. So then they lose interest if the track shifts away from their location, or they don't realize that the track could change in the future. Next slide. So given these misunderstandings and this desire for more information, researchers have been experimenting with alternative visualizations, some of which you can see on the slide. And while some of these alternatives have shown promise in kind of correcting these misunderstandings we pointed out in the previous slide, they have also introduced a host of other challenges. For example, in the case of the animated icon display, which you can see the blue arrow on the slide is pointing to, study participants were less likely to confound the graphic with storm size, but then on the flip side, they mistakenly believed that the animation was showing the passage of time. And there were also other limitations with technology and it not being advanced or fast enough, to create these alternative visualizations. But really the most important thing to take away from these visualization studies is that the researchers commonly found that any alternative visualization should be simple and communicative. For example, most of the people who participated in the study on the right side of the screen with the 5 visualizations, they said that they wanted to glean everything they need from the graphic in 20 seconds or less. Next slide. And then you can keep going to the next one. Okay, so as Linda pointed out earlier, the Hurricane Center issues tropical cyclone products not only in the United States, but also across the Atlantic and Eastern Pacific basins. And as such, we wanted to interview international meteorologists because we know that they are a very important user of the cone. So we spoke with partners from Met Services in Bermuda, Canada, Cuba, Jamaica, Mexico, and the Caribbean Netherlands. And what we were trying to find out is how integral the cone is to their decision making, whether it's adequately serving their communication needs, and if not, how we might improve the graphic to better meet their needs. Now, all of the international partners we talked to use the cone as an information source before a hurricane, but much like we saw with the public in the literature review, they are also relying on a variety of other information sources for their decision making, especially products that provide information on size, wind speed, rainfall, and storm surge probabilities. They use other NOAA products. They also rely on conversations with the Hurricane Center, and then they're using their own regional models and international models. And the partners highlighted some strengths and weaknesses of the cone. So on the positive side, it's very familiar to their audiences. It provides the first view of a storm's potential to make landfall, gives people an idea of possible movements, and it provides a high-level overview of the storm system, so things like likely track, watches, warnings, timing intervals. And finally, it can help people assess confidence as lead times get shorter. And then on the negative side, their audiences can over-rely on the graphic for decision-making. It doesn't provide information on hazards. While it is familiar and well known to the public, the cone is not actually well understood, so it requires a lot of public education. And then again, it does not explain impact. So given these weaknesses, they did provide some suggestions for enhancements. And so what the International Net said was that, think about producing a graphic with multiple layers that can show different storm parameters and hazards. So for example, using different colors for impacts, wind speed, and other hazards. Creating an interactive graphic so that users can focus on areas and information of interest. For example, enabling the user to zoom in on a particular segment of the cone. Overlaying the graphic with satellite imagery so users can see the storm extent. Providing context, for example, through mouse over explanations of different features to just aid understanding. And then producing a dynamic cone with real-time ensemble data instead of using the 5-year historical track.
Okay, I think now Lou will jump in and talk about the survey.
Great. Thanks, Linda. Why don't you go to the next slide? So we implemented a survey. We've targeted 4 sectors: transportation, tourism, recreation, energy and utilities, and marine. As you can see, the way the survey broke down here. We ended up with about a little under 500 total respondents for the survey of data that we could use. We implemented in both the Atlantic and Pacific regions. In other words, respondents to the survey could select where they did their work. We also got in the survey a fairly experienced and a fairly high-level group of respondents, which is what we were targeting, especially on the decision-making side. So 75% were either the primary or part of the top decision makers at their company, and 89% of them had 11 or more years of experience. So we have a pretty large survey data set to work with, and that's fairly experienced. And next slide, Linda. So the survey asked about a lot of things. It was fairly long. These are the key topics that we looked at in terms of general. We asked about prior storm experience and what sort of forecast parameters they look at, where they get their information, how they use weather service products for decision making. Then for the cone graphic in particular, we asked about familiarity with the graphic. We asked them to assess the features of it, how well different parts of it can be deemed in terms of their effectiveness for communication, how they interpret it given a scenario, and the importance of which this is to their decision making. So next, and we'll try to go through some of these as best we can. There's a lot in the survey report, and so we will try to do justice here to some of the really high level findings in the time that we have. So a couple big picture things across all of the 4 sectors. Respondents very familiar with the cone graphic. 95% said they were either very or extremely familiar with the graphic. And then it's also very important to their activities, operations, and decision-making. In that survey question, 90% of all respondents said that it's either extremely or very important to their decision-making. So the graphic, very familiar, very important to decision-making amongst our respondents. Keep going with it. So we did ask for interpretation of various things. So we gave them statements and we asked them to agree with the statement, and we found there were some misinterpretations. Certainly, the respondents thought it depicted areas that could experience strong winds. There was an inordinate number of people who agreed with that. Not a lot of people, but more often than not, people agreed with that statement, that it depicted an area that could experience strong winds. Also, more often than not, people indicated when strong winds are likely, that it indicates when strong winds are likely to arrive. So, not everybody's saying that, but definitely more often than not, they were saying that. And finally, it covers all possible tracks for the storm. But once again, more often than not, people agreed with that statement. And here you can see that amongst those misunderstandings, tourism and recreation sector actually stuck out. In other words, they tended to agree with that more often than the other 3 sectors. Also, the tourism recreation sector generally said they find the graphic effective and easy to understand. Now, and they also rated the graphic as important to their decision making fairly highly. So next slide. Like I said, we asked about prior experience with storms. So what we did is we looked at the way in which those who had prior experience with storms, in other words, they had experienced some sort of significant impact from a prior hurricane event. And we looked at that and how it related to the interpret the graphic. And what we found is that those with prior storm experience were more likely to understand that impacts can occur outside the cone boundary, that they're also less likely to believe that the graphic shows where the storm is likely to go, and they're also less likely to believe that the center line and cone feature are effective means of communication in the graphic. So certainly storm experience matters. In the report, there's also some results for those who had very little storm experience. And those tend to be the opposite of these, not in all cases, but for the most part, there's good contrast. That storm experience does matter in interpretation of the graphic. Next slide, Linda. So just to go through a few slides on what each of the other sectors, so we talked a little bit about tourism recreation. Let's talk a little about marine. The marine sector rated the cone graphic as very important to its decision making. They saw that some aspects of the cone were particularly hard to understand, in particular the legend. And in the write-in comments, those in the marine sector had pointed to this graphic here, the Mariner 123 rule graphic. So we presented here and in the report as what that is. But they pointed to this as something that they tended to use. Next slide, Linda. So for energy and utilities, it helps them decide whether and when to prepare, and very strongly rated on that it provides all the information that they needed for preparation. They rated that above other sectors than other sectors did. And next slide, Linda. And finally, just for transportation, they were less likely to understand that the cone size depends on the level of accuracy in previous track forecasts. That's kind of one area where the transportation sector stuck out. I will say, like I said, there's a lot of other pieces in the report. There's a lot of tables in that report to dig through, and there's a lot more information. So, Linda?
Great. Okay, and then I'll take it back now for a few slides just to talk about some of the common themes and findings that really stood out across all three phases of the research. So first off, like Lou just said, and what the literature showed, this graphic is very familiar to all of the audiences, from members of the public to the professionals that responded to the survey. It's very valuable for decision making, not only to the professionals in the survey, but also to the international forecasters. Now, we did see with the public, as Jen pointed out, that while this graphic is very familiar to people, it may not be, and hurricane graphics altogether may not be a key factor in some of the important decisions that they are making, such as those related to evacuation. So it's just one piece of information for all of the members of the public and for people in a professional capacity. And it is commonly misinterpreted. And what was interesting to us is that we expected to see these misinterpretations and misunderstandings by members of the public. But even with highly experienced professionals that responded to our survey, there are aspects of the graphic that are just not well understood or misinterpreted. And also of some potential concern is that even with this misunderstandings, there is a lot of reliance on this graphic and possibly some over-reliance on the graphic. As Lou just pointed out, the energy and utility sector in particular, I think, was 2.5 times more likely than the other sectors to say that they get all the information that they need from this graphic for decision making, which may be something the Hurricane Center might want to think about looking at in the future. And so a key thing about this graphic is that it is a complicated graphic. It has a lot of graphical elements, a lot of information. And so it may be a lot to try for people to try to process cognitively. But yet at the same time, we also heard not only from the international meteorologists, but members of the public through the literature review and on the survey that people want a lot more information. They want information about storm size, intensity, confidence in the forecast track, potential impacts. What are the hazards of most concern? Now that information can be found in other graphics, and one graphic maybe cannot do it all, but people do want all of this other information. So where to focus in looking ahead? Well, we know that visualizations are really powerful tools. They can be far more memorable than words alone, and they can really help convey technical and scientific concepts. However, if people are misinterpreting or misunderstanding a visualization, then we're losing some of the power of that impact. So as I just said, can one graphic do it all? Not only do people have a lot of different types of information that they want to know about, but they also have different levels of experience and knowledge. So this is often a challenge, I think, for NOAA and National Weather Service products, and we've seen this in our other work as well, in that products that may have been designed originally for professionals that have a particular level of expertise and experience are now being viewed, thanks to the web and social media, now are being viewed by all kinds of people, some of which do not have that same level of experience. So how do we meet the needs of the sophisticated user and the non-sophisticated user at the same time? Well, one thing that we really want to think about is in any kinds of changes, we want to make sure that we are going to test them with any kind of user group, whatever that change may be, whether we want to just continue with education or whether we want to make fundamental changes to the graphic. I think actually I might have missed the slide, or maybe it's not in here. No, I didn't. Well, let me just go back here. Somehow we missed one of our slides, or perhaps it's not showing up. So I don't know what happened there. We're missing one of our slides, but let me just step back before this testing and say that of all the different approaches ahead, you can do, the Hurricane Center can consider anything from education. Right now, the Hurricane Center has been doing a lot of education around the graphic. We put out a video earlier this year that helped to explain the graphic. Then there's cosmetic changes that could be made to the graphic. A lot of people suggested modernizing the graphic and making it look a little bit more sophisticated. As Jen pointed out, there can be a lot that we could use with technology to add layers of information and let people be active participants, choosing what kind of information they look at. That might be very useful to address those needs of the sophisticated and non-sophisticated users, so that there are these layers of information and there's one general portal that people can see basic information, but you could dig down deeper then and get the additional information, the more technical information that the more sophisticated users want. Then, as some of the studies pointed out with some of the alternative visualizations, we can rethink the graphic a little bit more altogether. We might think of combination of graphics or a series of graphics that people could see. And then there are some studies looking at totally different visualizations and different approaches for how the cone graphic is even derived. There's a lot that's been done with ensembles, with both positive and negative, implications. So something to consider there, perhaps. So I think that's pretty much it. We wanted to get done in our 30 minutes. And I guess we now would turn it back to you, John, and let us know if there are questions.
Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, so hi, this is Steve Smith. I joined a little bit late, but thank you all for a very interesting summary of the work. And at this point, we will take questions. So the audience, if you would like to ask a question to any of the panelists, please use the raise your hand feature or type your message into the chat. I'd like to start off with a couple questions. So one thing I don't know if this was came out in your research or not, but you mentioned that the cone is just part of a large suite of information that people have access to and use. But I wonder about its importance in terms of an agenda setting kind of piece of information, since it's not the end all be all, but it does tend to start and dominate the information flow. So did you get a sense for that, its importance with regard to that?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in with that a little bit. I mean, certainly just, in our interviews with the international meteorologists, depending on the country, very much like in America, a couple of the Caribbean countries said that, the first thing that members of their nations, that their publics tend to see is that cone graphic. And as soon as the cone graphic appears on television, much like it does here, people begin preparing and sometimes panicking. And so one of the things that we heard about, I think it was in Jamaica, was, people will go out and spend all their money on groceries. And then, if the hurricane does not come their way, then, that's a really unfortunate situation. So I think that was one of the things that we did here internationally, is it is so pervasive, and it's pervasive in those countries as well. So I think that does, you're right, it really does start the conversation going. And another interesting thing that we did here in talking to these international meteorologists, we asked them about the possibility of NHC putting out a 7-day cone. And there were pluses and minuses to that for this very reason. In Canada, there were concerns, and of course that country is very different, and they can have more than one storm at a time. They were very concerned about having a spin up any sooner than it's already happening, mostly because of concerns about resources, operational fatigue for themselves, their staffs, and also that they could have more than one storm going on at any given time. Now, some of the Caribbean countries thought that the 7-day cone would be helpful to them, just because it can take so much time to move people. So, it is something that I know we've heard it in other focus groups as well, that this cone is so pervasive, and it just starts the conversation very often, as you said.
Yeah, so it's interesting that the description for Jamaica applies to the east coast of the United States when there's a winter storm, but we don't typically have a cone for winter storms. We have different types of conversation starters. And for a small Caribbean island, 7 days out, the forecast is probably not that good. That could, right. Depending on how far and how fast the storm is moving. So a follow-up question, though, in the utility of this project, despite these issues, I got the sense that people calibrate this product somehow, either whether they've experienced a storm or not. And so in the calibration, find value in it. Is that a correct statement?
I think I'm not 100% sure I know what you're asking. I don't know.
Well, so if they view users find this graphic over year in and year out, season after season, they see these cones, and whether they're in the path or not, they act accordingly, and then they experience the storm or don't, and then the next time they see the graphic, they interpret it slightly differently because their personal experience has taught them to trust or not trust, or have a nuanced interpretation. So the value in the product, say for frequently affected areas, can grow with time just through this type of calibration that people apply to the information.
Right. I'm not actually sure if we can say that or not. I mean, I think what we found in the literature, I mean, people, evacuation decisions are just based on so many factors. And one key factor we certainly do know is that prior experience. And that can be negative or positive, right? Somebody who's been in a very difficult evacuation, I was in one this year, but then nothing happened, okay, they may be less likely to evacuate the next time. But as far as studies that looked at like people's reactions to the cone over time, you know, we'd have to go back to the literature review and see that and see whether, you know, I'm not sure that we saw that, I guess, in any of the literature. Like, is there a difference, you know, in looking at this cone over time? Most of the studies really didn't do anything like that. It would just, you know, present maybe alternative visualizations or ask about interpretations of the cone. So I'm not sure if we can really make that correlation, that seeing the cone and familiarity and having experience, you know, with members of the public, that is, if we can make that, you know, that judgment. And I will say the other thing is, you know, with members of the public, it does seem to be the most familiar and pervasive image that they see from NOAA products, but then they're seeing a lot of other information on television, on social media, they're listening to their friends and family. So all of those other influences can sometimes have more importance than, say, a single graphic. So I think that's something else to consider.
Okay.
Different, of course, for professionals.
Very good. Thank you very much. John, do we have some questions from the audience?
Yes, Dr. Uccellini has joined us and he has his hand raised. Go ahead, Dr. Uccellini.
Oh, thanks. So first of all, I appreciate this presentation. It's certainly very helpful. I've got a couple of things I think I need to say here, since I was there as this was being created, you know, coming out of the U.S. Weather Research Program. So, you know, what was the problem before we had the cone, right? The problem was that everybody was fixated on the track, the one line, right? And this was at a time when we had 3-day forecast. You know, the whole idea of then going to 3 to 5, we didn't want people fixated on the line kind of thing. So it was this idea that there was this cone of uncertainty with respect to the track. All right, so I think that is getting lost a little bit, and it's, you know, I mean, in terms of how people are interpreting it and using it. But I wouldn't want to go back to the single line because that was a bigger problem, right? So let's you know, we still got to figure this out. So that was point number one in terms of why it was needed. Point number two, with respect to the public and the general public, I mean, my God, they're interpreting ensemble model runs now. So the spaghetti charts, you know, is a big thing within not only the public domain but within the television domain because it apparently sells. You know, I mean, the producers like showing this stuff, and Euro versus the U.S., which is really, you know, posed incredible issues with respect to Irma when you know, with the long lead times needed by the emergency managers, you got one model showing, you know, the storm going up the east coast of Florida and the other one going up the west coast of Florida, and then flipping the next model cycle, and television just really focusing on these changes when, you know, the folks that had to make decisions in Florida were saying it doesn't really make any difference because the whole state's still going to be impacted one way or the other. So it was really important, which brings me to my comment that, or the question to you. I didn't see anything in the slides or the analysis that actually says the cone is an official forecast coming out of the National Hurricane Center by people who have seen all the model runs, right, kind of thing. And this is their forecast. And the reason I'm emphasizing this, it really got hammered home, I think, again by Irma, when I actually heard Ed Rappaport on TV, you know, say, is anybody interested in the official forecast? I mean, because the producers of these television, all into this Euro versus the. So I think in terms of how we move forward, at least I think that, and maybe the general population and folks using this and looking at it understand it, that, hey, it is the official forecast. But given the wide range, I am not sure that that's true. Okay. And I'm not sure if that question was asked as, you were doing the surveys or not, if people actually understood that that's not just one model or the Euro or whatever. It's our forecasters looking at all the products and producing an official forecast. And oh, by the way, they do have other products now that, like time of arrival of the tropical wind force, and which is also very important. And so it all goes in there. Now, so that was there. And the last thing was with the Canadians and their input, and a little worried about, they're going out to 7 days because their forecasters might be exhausted and all that. I can tell you that the users, the emergency management community, right, will, and we know that this is true because we see it happening. They want if they can have interaction with us further out in time, and not just out to day 7, I'm talking days 8, 9, like in Laura, 10, in some of the other hurricanes, right? That they're preparing, they're doing their TikToks starting from out there slowly, right? But if that consistency holds in day 10, 9, 8, 7, they're going full bore, 7, 6, 5. And going back to Irma with all that flopping around of the models up the East Coast to Florida, up the West, they went national, they actually went with a state emergency statement 6.5 days before landfall. So we got to be there. And the reason for them, the way I understand it, was they had to evacuate the Keys first and basically get those people out of the way if they had to evacuate Miami in other words, it fell within their order of what they had to do to evacuate key areas of their state with a storm that was forecast basically go right up the spine of the state, right? So that's what we have to respond to, not whether a forecast, we have to, be prepared for that kind of an event. And I wouldn't want that to get in the way of a day 7. If we start having predictive skill going up, and we're doing remarkably well, by the way, the official forecast using all this in days 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. 3, 4, and 5 has really shown tremendous progress. 6 and 7 is showing progress, but we still got a way to go. But if we're ready to make forecasts out in day 6 and 7 where the users are demanding it, for decision making, we got to look at that as a challenge that to address those user needs. And I think the questions that you're asking are really on target for that, not only in terms of the product for today, but also the product that we can envision 1 or 2 years out along the same line. So I'm just offering my comments and questions with respect to how do we move forward based on this great information you have, not as any kind of criticism of what the results are, because they're incredibly important to us. And I thank you for your efforts.
So would you like to respond to the Director of National Weather Service's comments and questions?
I hope you were taking notes, Stephen.
Yeah.
Well, I will say there's more on that 7-day cone in our report. And I will say that one thing we definitely heard from everybody is, yes, their partners would love it. And they would, I think they all for themselves, all the meteorologists for themselves were like, yes, we'd love to have it. Their concerns were, if it gets out into the public and we have to do all this, before the certainty is there, if it starts spinning up conversations that we're not ready, or that there could be credibility problems too far out. I think that was their concern. But I also think we definitely heard that they would like it and their partners would like it. It seems like it's another one of these situations, and I think we've heard this with some other weather service products as well. It's like, we don't want the public, we want it, but we don't want the public to have it, because then it creates it can create situations and problems for us. I think
Yeah,
that's
can I've heard this as long as I've been in the Weather Service, and I do not agree with that. That the fact is, there's so much model output out there through public web services already. If we don't bring a level of well, what's the official? That's why I'm saying, can we bring this
Yes.
back to the official forecast, right?
Yeah.
But you can't stop these products from going out. What are we going to do? Stop the global models when they get, when they're actually showing a more valuable signal at day 6 and 7? We're still going to say, hey, let's not show that to the public, because what's really fascinating here is the public really is becoming weather-wise with all this information, which is why I believe the television stations are responding to these forecasts and getting them out, because this is the way they draw their viewership in. It's not with the 15-minute sports show. It's with weather at the beginning of their segment, in the middle, and all during the segment if they have to. So the public is, I get questions, from everybody about ensembles. I mean, it's really remarkable, They find out I'm the director of the Weather Service, and they want to know about the Euro versus this, and then they want to know about ensembles. So this is just a background signal that's out there, and we have to be responsive to that. But we also have to be clear on what's an official forecast coming out of the National Hurricane Center, collaborated with the rest of the Weather Service, and the other parameters in precipitation, severe storms, the storm surge. I think, we have to be clear that this is the official forecast. And then how do we best represent that with all of the other information that's out there? So I think that's part of the challenge, especially if we go with longer lead times. But that's my view. I'm staying true to that, but also understand that we have a lot to learn from the interactions that are really needed for is message delivered equal to message received. I understand that that's a bridge that we have to build and continue to build and look at. So.
Yeah, and I do think that is a really key point. What you said is that information, and we did hear that too, that information is getting out very early. It's on social media very early. And I know we've heard that in some focus groups as well. There is this vacuum, of information. And I think, agree that it is important for the Weather Service to have that official information out as soon as we possibly can.
Okay, thank you, Louis, and thank you, panel. John, do we have another question from the audience?
We do not at this time.
All right. Well, I've got some more canned here ready to go. So you mentioned this misinterpretation kind of in general. Did you have evidence of sort of, I don't know, really bad misinterpretation? People said, well, I thought it meant this and I did this and a bad thing happened, or was it an irritation? I'm trying to see what the consequence is of misinterpretation.
Yeah. Jen, do you want to talk about that at all? Maybe the, very early, there were early studies, and I think they mostly had to do with the center track line.
I can't, it's like this lit review was 2 years ago at this point. I'm trying to remember really like a particular study where someone made a really, catastrophic decision.
Where I'm trying to go here is, in what we consider doing in the future in the Weather Service, part of the calculus is to determine, this product's been around, it's known, it's not perfect. Are there ways we can, make it better incrementally, or have we seen evidence that there's some serious problems that we want to consider a major change in the approach for
Right.
this. That's kind of the thought process.
Right. I think the misconception that the cone is an impact area is one in particular to maybe think about paying attention to. I am looking back at the literature study, and even in 2016 with Hurricane Matthew, and this was an NWS service assessment, did find that some NWS partners and members of the public were looking at the cone as an impact area. So I think that's one of the most common, misconceptions, and certainly one of concern, that if people think they're looking at the cone and they think they're okay if they're not in the cone, when impacts can go so very far out, and they're certainly doomed if they're inside. That misinterpretation on impacts is something that I think is pretty key.
Hey, Linda, this is Robbie. I was also curious if you have the results in front of you with the questions where we had the stars on the map and asked people if they were inside or outside the cone, how they interpreted the possible impact.
Yeah, that one, I have to go back and look, but that really, I think people were pretty in line with their interpretations. And however, those were more professionals, decision makers in the particular sectors. So there, I think that is, that is something else to consider, is that, that misperception was one documented with members of the public. But the survey went out to people that were very experienced and professional in their line of work.
Yeah, and in the survey, Robbie, those that were more experienced with storms certainly understood better that they could be, if they're we had those graphics where we said, okay, you're in point A, which is just outside of the cone, or point C, which is just outside of the cone. Those who are more experienced were more likely to say that they would be likely to experience impacts in those areas. So as you move down kind of that experiential scale, those who had less experience with storms were less likely to see that just being just outside that cone, that they still could experience impacts. But once again, like Linda said, these are kind of people who are in the business of preparing for storms, so to speak. So, but for the most part, people understood that.
I think one thing that struck me is that for the less experienced people, even the experts, if they were given a point just outside the cone and that area happened to be painted with a hurricane warning, they often neglected that hurricane warning. They were still stuck on the cone itself. At least that's what it looked like when I saw the results.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. John, do we have any other from the audience?
Nope, no one has raised their hand, or there are no questions.
All right, well, we've got some time to left, so I'll take advantage of that. So what we've seen in other warning areas, particularly tornadoes, and is a question of false alarms, that there's, in certain areas, there's a sort of penalty function, if you will, for missing a tornado. Therefore, we tend, where we can, issue tornado warnings in an effort to, sort of make sure that something's out there, even if we're not really sure. And there's some evidence that can breed some complacency in the population affected by tornadoes, so that they may not respond. They sort of become desensitized. So does any of the cone things related to the cone indicate that might be a problem, that people see this, and again, if they're not in the cone themselves, they sort of say, oh no, I won't bother, that they sort of take inordinate risk in again, knowing that I guess with the exception of Louisiana, this particular hurricane season, generally, even in the hurricane-prone areas, they don't experience them that often. Any sense of that from your study?
Going back to the literature review again, I mean, a common thing that is found with members of the public is, there can be a tendency to anchor to the track, both in terms of if the track changes and it's no longer, exactly near them, that they can lose interest. But yet, as we talked about, the impacts from a hurricane can extend for miles. So that can certainly be a dangerous misconception. And, that's the important thing too, is that people might look at the track at a particular point in time, maybe too early, and figure that, oh, it's not coming toward me. But, we know that track can change. And certainly we've seen these hurricanes that can suddenly intensify. So, right, there is this anchoring situation that can happen that can put people in danger if they're not, if they don't pay attention to the track over time, or they lose interest too early. So that's one thing that we did see in the literature that really was showing up quite a few times.
Yeah, this also came up in the international interviews as well. So Jamaica actually said explicitly that their populations do become desensitized to the cone over the years. And the way they framed it is that their members of the public don't view it as a cone of uncertainty, but instead as a cone of certainty. And that's really detrimental for their public, especially because a lot of them are low income and they're making decisions based on, perceiving this as a cone of certainty, and that can just have really negative impacts for them economically. So they'll make costly preparedness decisions and they'll spend their entire salary preparing for a storm that never impacts them. And then those kind of experiences do desensitize them over time.
So then a lot of messaging too going on. They told us that the thing with the cone graphic is, and broadcasters do, provide that context and explanation. And in the case with the international meteorologists, some of these meteorologists are actually the ones going on television, and they always say they need to explain the graphic, that there's always explanation that they need to provide around the graphic to help manage those perceptions and expectations.
Yeah. And I'll add one more from the survey. We did have a question in there. We showed a graphic, and respondents could see one of 4 points on the graphic. It was a picture of Florida and a cone kind of coming over Florida. And you could see one of 4 points, and you were asked, if you were at that point, what would you do? And we gave them a list of activities which they could do to prepare. So when respondents were put kind of in the middle of the cone, it's kind of clear they're going to be in the path of the storm, they kind of labeled how much they would prepare. But then those that were kind of just outside, just north of the cone, who saw that point just north of the cone, they indicated they were less likely to prepare in every single category of preparation that we asked them about. And then those that were further back, kind of away from where the cone was kind of pointing towards, they also said they were less likely to prepare. And those, we had a point kind of all the way over in Texas, and which was kind of where the cone graphic extended as far as we could extend it to, but they were just outside the cone and they prepared even less. So certainly, if you baseline kind of for those who are in the cone's way against those who are just outside of it, you can see kind of how much less preparation those people were doing, and clearly where we put them, we put them kind of like, it looks like kind of right on the coast of Georgia there. So clearly they're at risk of being hit by the storm, but they're clearly not taking the same precautions as those who were clearly put within kind of smack dab in the center of Florida.
Okay. So lastly, I wanted to follow up on the point was raised about the tourism industry in particular. So we know with the rip current phenomena that in Florida in particular, but all along the East Coast actually, there are a lot of tourists who go to the beach, and they're you could say beach novices. They don't understand the rip current threat, and so one of the areas we've looked at is to try to up the education through the tourism industry, hotels in particular, about this particular very dangerous threat. So getting back to the overall hurricane problem, by the way, which is generally there's rip currents associated with those too, but for the hurricane, did you sense the tourism industry, they're sensitized to their clientele being particularly vulnerable in interpreting what to do, with a landfalling hurricane and how to interpret the cone? Or are they acting as mediators for their clients to help them decide what to do, during their vacations?
Yeah, I'm not sure the survey where we kind of asked the tourism sector in particular about it. I'm not sure we got into that in depth with them. We were really kind of asking, which sector do you belong in? If they screened in that, and they said tourism, recreation, then they kind of screened into that. There weren't questions that were specific to kind of tourism and how they deal with their clients of being, tourists coming in and such. So we never kind of got to the, okay, now that you're a tourism sector respondent, how are you dealing? Are you preparing your clients for this? So we didn't kind of get into that detail. Everybody, we wanted to know what sector were they in, and then everyone was kind of asked the same types of questions. So I don't know if the literature said anything on that or not.
Yes, I don't think that we got into that in the literature that we looked at. I don't, Jen, do you know I don't think that we saw any studies. No,
Yeah, and even in the survey, there's a broad list of people. The survey was sent out from the WFOs. We sent out some ourselves, but it was sent out from the WFOs to their distribution list. I can't remember in the survey. Linda, did we ask them to kind of, give us more details on who they are in the sector, kind of what they do? I don't remember if that was a second question. We debated it for months. But we asked if they're in the tourism sector, and then I think we might have asked them to provide more details. So, obviously tourism can be a lot. It can be everybody from, charter boat operators right down to hotels and such. So there could be a broad array in there. And what we haven't done in the survey analysis is go back. We have those data is parsed out. How do kind of different parts of the tourism sector look at respond? We might, if we did that, we might be slicing the data points so thinly that it might not tell us too much. Although we had 500 respondents, we got to sort of divide that between 4 sectors to begin with, and then start dividing that up. We get really thin slices at that point.
I mean, what we might look at, if it's of interest for that particular sector, if there's certain types of information. In particular, we had all of the NOAA hurricane products, both from the National Hurricane Center and that are being put out from WFOs listed, and kind of asked about reliance and importance of these different forecast parameters. So, what we could find out is what information in particular is important to them. What we don't know is what they do with that information or how they pass it along, if they do, to their customers or to the tourists in the area. That would probably be a separate venture.
Sure. All right. Well, I think we're about out of time. So I want to thank the speakers for bringing the results of this really important study to our audience and sharing it with us. And I want to remind folks that the session has been recorded, and we'll upload the recording to the VLab Forum website shortly after, and you can share it with your colleagues at your leisure. So I want to thank again all of you and Jen Sprague for making this project come to fruition. And I guess I'll just turn it over to John to wrap it up. And what is our upcoming talks for the VLab Forum?
Sure. We have later this month, in fact, Thursday of next week, we have Running UFS on the Cloud by Arun Chawala. In November, we have Blending NBM and Tropical Cyclone Winds by Jeff Wagner. And then December 16th, we have Risk and Uncertainty, communication using probability information update. Again, another social science presentation by Dr. Ripperger, and Jen Sprague will be with us. Looking way out into January and February, we have the whole story, Uncertainty and Probability Viewer, version 2 by Dana Strom. And then February, Florida Summer Pop Climatology to supplement the National Blend of Models by Brian Rokraska.
All right. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us on a Friday, and have a good weekend. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.